Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Margaret Ross. I'm one of the vice principals here at the university, and I'm here on behalf of the principal to welcome you most warmly to the David Buchan Lecture. The principal's very sorry that he can't be with you this evening because he's out of town. I welcome you all, whether this is a familiar location to you or whether it's new. The warmth of the welcome is just the same, and I know that we will be entertained and informed most handsomely this evening by our guest speaker. This lecture was set up to celebrate 20 years of the Elphinstone Institute, a very important part of the activity here in this university, which celebrates the culture, the folklore, the ethnography of this region and much further afield. And it's wonderful to be able to celebrate the longevity of the Institute and to thank all of those who support it in its work throughout the years, not least, of course, the director, Tom McKean. So, having given that welcome, my function is actually over, and I am going to hand over to Tom, because Tom will tell you a little bit more about the work of the Institute and also introduce you to our distinguished lecturer this evening. So thank you very much for coming. I hope we'll see you again on campus for other activities, but of course for next year's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. That's the first advertisement for next year's lecture, so put the date in your calendars. But we have this one to get through first, and Carl has this one to get through first. But I wanted to tell you a bit before we start about the Institute. Founded in 1995, as Margaret said, to build a bridge between the region, the community, and the university. They belong to each other, and they should inform each other, it was felt. And so this connection between the culture of the northeast of Scotland and the university was enshrined in the Elphinstone Institute, a way of connecting through research and promotion and celebration of the rich diversity of northeast culture, both that which is traditional and reaches back into the past and that which is contemporary practice, things going on nowadays. To do that, we do folklore, ethnology, ethnography, which are ways that we look at individual experience, at families and communities, and the way they make sense of the world around them. And one of the ways that they do that is by performing folklore. And folklore can be customs or songs or other kinds of traditions, but also narrative. We always talk to each other, we tell stories to each other. You'll never guess what happened yesterday that happened to me. Every kind of communication, pretty much, that happens between people is through narrative of some kind. And as folklorists and ethnologists, we're interested in the individual experience, which gives meaning to the broader range of social history. It's not for us to examine the big historical sweeps of history, whether they be famines or wars or major sort of macro experiences like that, but rather individual experience of those things, of every aspect of daily life. And so we focus in on the individual and individual experience. And one of the ways we do that is by talking to people, by fieldwork, by sitting down with ordinary folks and talking to them about how they've made their way through life, how they have experienced life, how they package it up and explain it to other people and pass along their culture. We also do teaching. We have an MLit in ethnology and folklore, to which you are all invited, nay, required to sign up perhaps later. If you want to learn more about how we do our work and learn field work and get out there and do things, record people and study some of these little bits of Scottish history and Northeast history that you may know that you think other people should know and explore. And that's what we try to do through this kind of field work. We also do research and publication. The fieldwork really informs our own work as academics, but also our public engagement work and our publication work, where we bring some of this material together into books, papers, CDs, websites. We're working on much more sort of interactive multimedia website materials in the coming year to make the website a little more dynamic, more reflective of contemporary Northeast culture, what it does. And that leads to public engagement. With the foundation of this research, this understanding we gain by speaking to the experts, which are Northeasters of all descriptions, we then aim to promote Northeast culture in several different ways. And one of these is through renewal, by putting together workshops. This is a Boaties workshop in Peterhead set up by Ian Russell a number of years ago, where older, skilled workers within the tradition can teach younger people not just how to mold bits of wood, but also the bigger traditions surrounding it, the community events that go with making these boats and racing them on the loch, so that there's a wider community impact as well. It's not just the skill of doing this, but all sorts of little Trojan horse skills and ideas about community and cooperation that arise out of learning things like this. There's an element of negotiation, working with the people who burn the clavey at Burghead on the 11th of January, helping them in their liaisons with the police service and with the council and so on about valuing the knowledge and expertise that these people have within their own community to carry burning stuff around safely. They're the experts, and we've helped in the past with helping the community negotiate those ways forward for their tradition within the bounds of what health and safety and so on require. So we act as a kind of a go-between in some cases, or at least putting our oar in when asked to help support such things. Sustenance by festivals and workshops and performances. We provide places for people to go and share some of these wonderful traditions. This is the Killarely Traditional Singing Weekend out at Killarely, just west of here, an annual event where 65 singers come together and share traditional songs of many varieties over the weekend. Evolving traditions. Tradition is not static. In fact, tradition to survive has to change. I often say it's like a virus, which is maybe not the best analogy, but it does sort of cling on to the next host and find a way to perpetuate itself. So from neepy lanterns to scary plastic costumes and points in between. We think about social resilience, how traditions, how skills, and the ability to interact in communities can help create social resilience. And these are examples from Banff and Macduff and Port Soy, boat building traditions, which, again, it's going back to that idea that it's not just learning the skill, but it's learning to work alongside someone. It's learning to judge your actions with the materials. People start out making these boats using tape measures and pencils and everything, and after a few weeks, they're feeling the wood and feeling the curve and feeling whether it's right. Some of the young boys who go into these workshops are typical young teenage boys staring at the floor, not saying a word. 3 months later, they're talking to people, they're interacting, they're looking people in the eye. And Chevron has supported some of these workshops through the good offices of the folks in Port Soy, and Lorna Summers is here somewhere, one of the organizers of that whole community up there, who've really created something out of their local traditions of very contemporary relevance. And I'm not saying that this is one of our projects, but this is the kind of thing that we like to support and do what we can to support communities to do this kind of thing, which is repurposing older traditions for contemporary purposes. And that kind of education and future-proofing, again, not just of the skills, but of the community skills, the community social resilience that derives from community activity like that. So this David Buchan lecture was set up 3 years ago in honor of the 20th anniversary of the Elphinstone Institute, and it's named after the first director-designate of the Institute, a native Aberdonian with St. Combs roots. You'll be pleased to know that he's related to the Buchans of the Northeast, which means he has 50,000 cousins up St. Combs Way. He was a very distinguished folklorist who spent most of his career in the US and Newfoundland, sometime at Stirling University as well. And he did a lot of work on ballads and folk tales, but also on medical traditions. He was very interested in narrative traditions of every size, from folk tales to ballads, which are a kind of narrative as well, and to these narratives of traditional healing recorded in the writings of Dr. David Rory, a medical doctor here in the Northeast, who went around and noted down folk remedies as he came across them, while simultaneously slightly sneering at them as well. But at least he noted them down, and David Buchan edited a collection of his writings on medicine. So we're pleased to honor David Buchan, son of Aberdeen, who never got the chance to come back and work professionally in Aberdeen as a folklorist. Unfortunately, he acquired some nasty form of cancer and died at the age of, I believe, 54 or something like that, much too young. But nevertheless, he left behind a great legacy, not only of scholarship, but of people who were influenced by his thinking and his scholarship. And I know that Carl, our speaker tonight, was a friend of David Buchan's and also of our late lamented Bill Nicolaisen, who was with us for many years. So there's a good, strong Aberdeen connection between Carl and Aberdeen and the Institute as well, which is a very nice extra added feature for tonight. A couple of books, some of David Buchan's books. In the middle there, the medical writings of David Rory. So with that connection of David Buchan's work on narrative with legend and with narrative structures within ballads and folk songs as well, we're going to move on to our talk tonight, which is by Professor Carl Lindahl, looking at narrative as a way of getting through trauma. And remember, I said folklore is about making our way through the world, making sense of the world. And one of the ways we do that is through narrative. So I'd like to turn over to Carl now, who's going to talk about folk narrative as terror therapy, as a way of working our way through the world. So, Carl.
Thanks so much. Well, thank you very much, Tom. It is an honor and a gift to be welcomed by the Elphinstone Institute, Thomas McKean, Nicholas Labigre, whose last name I'm still having trouble pronouncing, Francis Wilkins, Allison Sharman are people who've given me a great welcome here. And I've had a chance to meet some of your extraordinary students here. This is a place that would make David Buchan very, very proud. I'm also deeply honored to be speaking on an occasion named for David Buchan, who was a major influence on my life as a folklorist. He was a mentor and a friend, and he gave me extraordinary guidance at a time when I really needed it. So I think much what I say here, the good parts anyway, I owe to him. After David passed, his widow presented me with one of his jackets. So I am actually wearing now a jacket that belonged to David Buchan, and it has not been back in Aberdeen for 24 years. So I feel very good to be taking it here, and more honored than I can say to be here at this occasion. For me, it's a humbling and more than frightening prospect to be speaking about something that I would hope would please David. David was known for two things that influenced me greatly. One was an extraordinary rigor in the work that he did. And second was an absolute delight that he took in the people he worked with and with their artistic creations. So I've tried to put together something that can speak in both ways to rigor and to delight in what I'm talking about. And I am sure that David would not feel I quite got there in the paper that I'm presenting to you today, but I think he would appreciate the fact that I tried. So that's where we're going to go with this. And as you see here, I've changed the title a little bit even since yesterday to reflect what I think I have the best opportunity to say to you today about dreaming, storytelling, and the sort of therapy that's accomplished by doing both of those things. In the early 1970s, Maggie Hammonds Parker, whom you see behind me, of the West, well, you don't see behind me, of the West Virginia mountains, shared a story about the first days of her family history on the Appalachian frontier. Her forebears settled in a place where only Native Americans had lived before. In her words, there was just 2 families of the white people that lived there, and all the others were Indians. And there was an old Indian, always came every day. He said after he got acquainted with them, he'd come every day and talk with them and share stories. And my people liked that old Indian. They seemed like they was awfully good people to my folks. After a while, though, one of the Indians come. He told my great-grandpa, I had a dream last night. Always, when we dream anything, our dreams have to come true. Now, that's the way it goes with us Indians. Well, great-grandpa had a gun, awful nice gun. He wouldn't have took nothing for that gun. And the Indian told him he dreamt about owning the gun. And great-grandpa couldn't do a thing but let the Indian take the gun. He was afraid not to, I guess. Well, it pretty nigh killed him to give up that gun, and he didn't know what kind of plan to fall on to get his gun back. Finally, after a couple of weeks passed, he went over and he told that Indian that he had a dream. He said, I dreamt about owning my gun back in one of your ponies. The Indian studied for a while before he said anything. But then at last he said, take it, paleface, but dream no more. And my great-grandpa took the gun and the pony, and that was the end of that part of that story. In this story, the Indians live in a world where dreams create waking reality. If it comes into your sleeping mind, it has to be true. The only way to keep your dreams from shaping your world is not to dream at all. But in this traditional tale, and there are several versions of this stories that are told elsewhere, true as it may be in this family history, there are a dozen other versions in the Appalachians with a similar plot. But in this particular version, it is not only the dream, but it's really the story that shapes reality. Last night I dreamed you gave me your gun. There's a rudimentary story there, a beginning. The Indian tells his story to make his dream come true. And then great-grandfather does the same with powerful results. In the mechanics of the tale, it is the story that makes the dream come true. The Indian tells his dream to make it come true, and great-grandpa responds in kind. At the very least, the story is working for the dream, but the story could easily be more than that. The story may well be the real dream, because in the majority of the versions of this story, as it circulates in this area, we are not told that any dream really happened. Both tellers could have made up the dream to get what they wanted. In this particular story, then, there is no dream, actually, that happens without the story. Maggie Hammonds embeds this anecdote in a long tale from her family saga about their earliest relationships with the cultures that peopled Pocahontas County in West Virginia before the Europeans. In the full-blown tale, the dream prefigures an Indian attack. Maggie's tale presents 2 opposed sides of the native cultures, as seen by the newcomers. There is the generous old man who shares his life and his stories with the settlers, and then there's the unnamed Indian who only takes from the paleface until great-grandpa finally turns the tables on him. You've heard the end of the first scene, but not the whole story. In the next and final act, the kindly grandfather Indian comes to the settlers and warns them that members of his tribe are planning to attack and kill them. All we can assume at this point, I think fairly, is that the man who had to give back the gun and surrender his pony was among the people who wanted to kill Grandpa and his family. But the grandfather was able to communicate to great-grandpa and get him to shepherd his family's safety before the attack ever happened. Among many other things, Maggie's story is saying that you can trust an Indian's words to be true, but you need to trust the Indian before you even let him talk to you at all. In the world of story, we are all Indians. Through stories, we all dream, even sometimes in spite of ourselves. And our dreams do, in some strange and remarkable ways, come true. Stories like Maggie's have a way of explaining and then shaping reality. The reality that Maggie creates in this story is a charter for her family's mixed feelings about Native Americans. Like most Appalachian families, she depicts Indians as both benevolent and threatening. Nearly every family in her area claims Indian blood in their background, but also nearly every family claims an ancestor that was killed by the Indians. In a few minutes of narration, Maggie brilliantly condenses the remarkably conflicted attitude toward Native Americans that pervades in her part of the Appalachians. It would have taken her 1,000 more words to try to translate these feelings into an analytic argument. And even then, even the most finely crafted argument would not be as persuasive as that amazing story that she shared back in the 1970s. Why? Because a plot seems to be the most important argument a human being can muster. A story acts on us to make itself true. Psychologists are now beginning to discover that fiction holds more sway on readers and film more sway on watchers than do rational arguments about the issues that they engage. In experiments with readers, Keith Oakley, the author of Such Stuff as Dreams, has shown that contrary to our stereotype of the mildly sociopathic bookworm, which most of us have been at one time or another, who uses her books as a barrier to shut out the harsher world, people who gorge themselves on fiction tend to have greater social skills than those who do not. Fiction acts for them, in Oakley's words, as a sort of flight stimulator, parading endless examples of how to act and how not to act among other people. Those lessons are not retained in the conscious mind, but they stick nonetheless and become internalized as an inventory on how certain actions succeed and others fail in given situations. What is so compelling about these stories? According to Raymond Marr, quoting him, researchers have repeatedly found that reader attitudes shift to become more congruent with the ideas expressed in a fiction narrative. And Jonathan Gottschall, who is the author of a book titled, I've just forgotten the title, sorry about that, I'll get back to that later. No, it's called The Storytelling Animal. It's about human beings as narrators and the persistence of narration. Summarizing Mars's findings, reports that fiction seems to be more effective at changing beliefs than nonfiction, which is designed to persuade through argument and evidence. We might conclude from Gottschall that stories are more important than information itself. But I think it's more accurate to say that in a traditional community, in an oral context, stories are the most important kind of information. They are the primary tools in a community, from the time you're a child in your family community to other communities you inhabit, for teaching, conveying memories, and sharing values. As with fiction, so with visual storytelling. In experiments conducted by Marcus Appel, watchers of TV dramas were shaped by these, I'm behind there, there's Gottschall's reference here. Watchers of TV drama were shaped by TV stories to view the world as a far more just place than people who watch the TV news. The drama programs operated by a kind of poetic justice that made good people and good motives prevail, and to act out the goodness in people so that the worldview embodied in their plots shaped the attitudes and the actions of the people who watched them. Returning to the European settlements on the mountain frontier, The power of books to reshape even the wildest environment is illustrated in a court record dating from 1790, in which Daniel Boone, the archetypal frontiersman himself, testified in a land dispute. That's the only reason we know these stories were told. And this involved a wilderness creek with the strange name of Lulbograd. In 1770, some years before Kentucky's first permanent European settlement, Boone and 5 fellow hunters were working their way through the wilderness. Boone remembered, quoting him, "We had with us for our amusement the history of Lemuel Gulliver's Travels," which was Boone's favorite book beside the Bible, according to people who knew him. And they read this bestseller aloud together whenever opportunity afforded while they were camping. One section that stuck in the listeners' minds, was one that he testified in court. It involved the giant folk of the place called Brobdingnag. Boone recalled the scene of a young Brobdingnag woman carrying Gulliver to a town called Lulbograd. The young woman stood, according to Swift, not above 40 feet high, being small for her age. With her giant stride, she carried him into Lulbograd, the capital of Brobdingnag and the pride of the universe, as described by Gulliver. So you can actually see the image of the tiny Gulliver there by the hand of the giant nurse there. The story stuck with its listeners. Not after their communal reading of the scene, one of the men went off to hunt. And then back to quote Boone from his testimony, Alexander Neely returned to camp one night and told us that he had been that day to Lulbograd, and he had killed 2 Brobdingnags in their capital. Neely's words inspired a tall tale guessing game. What was he really talking about? And only with some effort were his companions able to figure out that Neely had been hunting at a salt lick by a creek and had killed 2 buffalo. In Neely's narrative, Kentucky transformed into Swift's land of giants. Neely's jest became a reality, a place on the map. The men called the creek Lulbograd, and to this day you can go to Lulbograd Creek in eastern Kentucky up against the mountains. Gulliver's Travels was likely the first work of printed fiction ever to make its way into eastern Kentucky, and within days of arriving, it was transforming the natural world and forcing its names upon the beasts and the rivers that were found there. Consider Daniel Boone's experience in light of current psychological findings on dreams and stories. The deeply suggestive studies that I've quoted from measure the powers of secondary forms of story, those that are read and those that are watched in movies. But as a folklorist, I must ask, can books or movies ever come close to matching the impact of a great traditional oral storyteller in that person's community? Yes, Boone and his party read Gulliver's Travels, but note that they read it aloud communally around the campfire, and further that not long after reading it, they began telling the stories of Gulliver's experiences as if they shared his fictional world. By acting out Gulliver's Travels, they were performing a bit of what folklorists call ostension, when they make their legends actually come to life. And these stories became true enough again to end up with this massive river from Brobdingnag now being a spot on the map in Kentucky to the present day. When the Hammond family arrived in West Virginia, oral storytellers had preceded them by half a century. The frontier memoirist Joseph Doddridge, who was born on the Appalachian frontier the year before Daniel Boone entered eastern Kentucky, recalled the entertainments that he practiced in his boyhood. And this is quoting him, "Dramatic narrations, chiefly concerning Jack and a giant, furnished our young people with amusement during their leisure hours. Many were lengthy and embraced a considerable range of incident. Jack, always the hero, after encountering many difficulties and performing many great achievements, came off the conqueror of the giant. In many of these stories, some captive virgin was released and restored to her lover. These dramatic narrations bore a strong resemblance to the poems of Ossian and to the tale of Giant Greatheart in Pilgrim's Progress, and were so arranged in their incidents that they were easily committed to memory. They certainly have been handed down from generation to generation, from time immemorial. Along with these tales, when Doddridge describes what the kids did, he describes their childhood war games, simulating the kinds of violence that their fathers experienced and often died from right outside the walls of the fort. By 1778, when Boone was defending Boonesboro from Indian attack, Doddridge was a boy of 9, growing up a few miles east on the frontier, and the boys' play was essentially playing Indian. Kids practiced throwing tomahawks, shooting arrows, and imitating the calls of birds and the howls of wolves that were made by the Indians that surrounded the fort. This play possessed a sober and not-so-secret purpose, for as Doddridge explains, among young men belonging to nations in a state of war, many amusements are regarded as preparations for the military character which they are expected to sustain in future life. The more I think about these early stories in their context, in the middle of the wilderness, the more I feel that these stories acted out by Boone and his friends while utterly alone in the massive woods, and the jack tales told by Doddridge's boyhood buddies in the midst of their all too relevant war games were performed largely for one reason: to impose the familiar plots and characters from the world they left behind upon a forbiddingly new and foreign landscape, and in the process render that landscape less frightening and more familiar. They drained the terror from that landscape by importing into it the well-known monsters of written and oral fantasy popular in their day. The old familiar monsters are always better than the new large ones out there in the woods. By 1820, when Doddridge wrote down his frontier memories, both the fears of the wilderness and the tales that functioned to name and tame that wilderness seem to have disappeared. He concludes his account by writing, "Civilization has indeed banished the use of those ancient tales of romantic heroism, but what then? It has substituted in their place the novel and the romance." But here Doddridge was wrong. The oral stories did persist, and they continue to live in ways that only the tellers and their listeners seem to remember. A century and a half would pass between the time Doddridge first heard them and the time that they reached the outside world in any printed form. But it's no doubt that they lived. It is my conviction that they persist today because more than the printed text and even more than the film narratives that play before hundreds at a time drawn together in a darkened theater, oral storytelling in traditional settings constitutes a kind of shared dreaming. Now, it was Carl Abraham, the man Freud called his best pupil, who stated that shared narratives, did I miss Carl Abraham? I did indeed. Oh well, Carl Abraham disappeared. Who stated that shared narratives are to the society as dreams are to the individual. And this is, I think, part of what I've been seeing. I've been experiencing my storytellers telling this, but it's been interesting seeing the scientists back it up. Like a film seen in a movie theater, an oral tale is shared, communally enjoyed, and that's part of its great power. Folk tales perform the work of darkness. It is the job of the storyteller to pull us into the world of dreams. With the lights out, you don't see anything on this earth as you listen, but you will experience dreams that can be heard. The process of traditional narration is an exercise in progressive sensory deprivation. The story unfolds in a darkened room with nothing to see, either total blackness or in some cases the play of flames in a fireplace. As vision becomes increasingly limited, the voice of the storyteller fills the darkness, usually rhythmic and often whispery, exercising a near hypnotic hold on the listener. As the room darkens, images take over. Under our eyelids, we begin to see things. And Marco Iacoboni, whose quote is there in front of you, is a leading figure in the research of what is called the mirror neuron, parts of the brain that become intensely activated by what we see. He discovered that when I see an act, say an act of violence, portrayed in a film or in my own dream, my mirror neurons respond to the visual image as if I were committing the act of violence myself. And Iacobini writes about this phenomenon as he's been studying it. Our brains recreate for us the distress we see on the screen. We have empathy for the fictional characters. We know how they're feeling because we literally experience the same feeling ourselves. And when we watch the movie stars kiss on screen, some of the cells firing in our brain are the same ones that fire when we kiss our lovers. Vicarious is not a strong enough word to describe the effect of these mirror neurons. I maintain that the images we project on the blank screen of the night engage us at least as much as the movie images. The more vividly we see the story in our mind's eye, the more story becomes our own. Not only because our minds have created these images in response to the story, but also because in the act of seeing them, our mirror neurons cause us to become what we have seen. So a great storyteller can literally recreate her listeners by coaching images from their minds. All of this I wouldn't believe had I not heard all this first in layman's term by this little girl here. And that is exactly what happened to my favorite Appalachian storyteller, Jane Muncie. When she was 3, her mother left the family, and she lived alone with her father until December 7th, 1941, in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Her father, a former Marine, immediately re-enlisted and left to fight, so at the age of 4, Jane effectively became an orphan. She saw later the telegram that her dad had sent her grandmother, "Mom, come get Jane, I'm going in." And so the grandmother, Sidney Farmer Muncie, took the bus all the way from Kentucky into Pennsylvania and brought back this little girl. She was weak, undergrown, and beset with what doctors call failure to thrive. Sidney Farmer, let's see, we got her there? There she is. Sidney Farmer Muncie, her 67-year-old grandmother, took her into the Kentucky mountain boarding house where she was living and set about strengthening Jane by telling her stories. Jane credited Sidney with saving her emotional life by shaping the tales into models for Jane to internalize and then literally to become, all through the power of narrative suggestion. Sidney's family had a large stock of traditional Jack tales, and Sidney immediately began altering Jack to become Jane and molding Jane into Jack. She changed the boy hero's name to create an androgynous figure that a girl could more easily identify with. In Sidney's performances for Jane, Jack was christened Merrywise. Like Jane, Merrywise was young and small and appeared to be weak, but the name and traits of Merrywise suggested to Jane a way to get beyond her weakness and thrive in the world. Drawing upon her grandmother's hints, Jane finished this transformation in her own imagination. And this is Jane speaking 50 years later after hearing these stories. When I look at the name Merrywise, you know, he was not only the youngest, but he could figure out things that the other folks couldn't. And so the message to me was, you can be little, and you can be frail, and you can be the youngest, and you can be alone, but you can also be the smartest. In the name Merrywise, Merry meaning happy, you could be happy. You could be happy, and you could be wise, and you can overcome. And so I began to think of myself as that overcomer. Sidney's art exploits the two essential tools of fairy tale narration. These easily remembered plots we've heard about, and these vivid images. The jack tales heard by Doddridge as a boy were structured to be easily remembered, and Jane's favorite story, the one that Sidney named Merry Wise after Jane's favorite character, possessed a plot ideal for conveying the idea that a seemingly weak child could become an overcomer. Merry Wise is the youngest of three boys. His older brothers scorn him, but when the three set off into the woods, suddenly it is Merry Wise who knows what to do, and through his knowledge, save them all. When the boys spend the night in a witch's house, the witch plans to kill the older brothers, but it's Merry Wise who foils the plot and masterminds the escape. When the witch, wearing her magic 7-mile-a-step boots, catches up with them and hypnotizes the older brothers into jumping into a magic bag, it's Merry Wise who, through sheer force of will, refuses to jump. Instead, he gets the witch to jump into the bag, pulls his brothers out, and then all three weigh her down with stones, throw it in the river, and drown her. The plot is quite easy to remember, but what was seared in Jane's memory to shape the story were the hints of images tossed out by her grandmother. Sidney's verbal descriptions, like the images of magic tales in general, tended to be vivid and richly suggestive, but sparse, bold outlines that needed to be filled in by the listeners. So you can think of the glass slippers and the glass mountains and the golden balls and all these other fixtures of fairy tales that stick in your mind from the first time you hear them, that you can see in your mind's eye, but are seldom illustrated for you when the story is told, except by Walt Disney, I guess, who doesn't really do a very good job. So Jane then learned these tales. And when Leonard Roberts, the folklore collector, went to visit her at age 11, he remarked on what a great storyteller she was. But she'd been listening to her grandmother tell these every night for 7 years. She'd been rehearsing for this command performance. And when she told the story then to the reel-to-reel tape recorder back in 1949, she had almost no details that she conveyed about the characters. She did say something about the witch to build into a pretty pervasive stereotype of witches. An old woman came to the door who had long hair, a long nose, and she was really ugly. But descriptions didn't go beyond that. More than the characters, it was the witch's magic props that had the greatest power to stick in Jane's mind. And these were props that were only described in the most vague terms. There was a 7-mile-a-step boot, or a funny-looking puddin' bag, it was called, that the witch used to swallow the victims. And these images became real for Jane, especially the puddin' bag, which she began to use around the household to name any funny-looking device for carrying objects. So she was indeed picking up these images and making them part of her daily life. With just a few words, Sidney shaped the tale to exert a great pull on Jane. When, for example, Merry Wise is sleeping near the witch, he lies awake and he hears her whisper, "I'll get up and whet my knife. I'll go up and whet my knife," as she's preparing to cut off the heads of Merry Wise's brothers. This is a phrase that Sidney would use, but then she would whisper suggestively to Jane, Merry Wise was too small to hurt the witch, so he listened to every sound she made because that's what he could do. And such phrases then were planted to assure Jane that being small and weak would not prevent her from becoming the overcomer. And it's indeed hearing the witch whisper in a sort of trance-like state that she was going to kill the kids that makes her get her brothers out of there in time. According to neuroscientists, the plot in the image, the defining features of the fairy tale world style find their strengths in opposite parts of the brain. The left hemisphere contains the plotting part. It controls speech and creates narrative order. The right hemisphere, incapable of producing speech, responds instead to visual stimuli governing facial recognition and eye motor coordination. In those rare human beings whose right and left hemispheres do not communicate effectively with each other, the left brain will always be able to construct a narrative explanation for an image, whereas the right brain will generate physical and emotional reactions but cannot articulate what the image means. In combining easily remembered plots with powerful emotion-inducing images, the fairy tale pushes both sides of the brain to interact in extraordinary ways. This is the magic of the magic tale. It's acting us to act in our mind in two different ways at the same time. It is the perfect vehicle for posing and working out serious community problems, and more influential than any argument for inducing the listener to act in certain ways. The plot of Merry Wise is not only easily remembered, but very old and diffused around the world. Merry Wise belongs to a constellation of tales broad enough to encompass both Hansel and Gretel and Jack and the Beanstalk. They're both part of the same two-tale type configuration that have to do with child heroes who use their wits to avoid being eaten by a giant witch or ogre. There are hundreds of closely related versions. There are tales like Molly Whuppie in Scotland and Kitty Ilpretz told here, and Muncie and Little Nippy in the Appalachians. And these stories do have a shared history in their transmission. The presence of these similarly plotted stories over vast reaches of time and space have led people over the ages to say these plots must exist because they have this one imperishable meaning that has great import for all of us, the problem being that every theorist who comes out has one imperishable meaning that's different from all the others that have been proposed. This similarity, what the persistence of these similar plots means to me, is that the most persistent plots retain their popularity precisely because they can mean many things to many people and be manipulated by the people telling the stories, the master narrators, to make them exactly relevant to the people they're talking to in their own communities. Such tales are popular because their relatively rigid structures have been shaped to accommodate this huge variation in meaning. So the tale becomes a matrix for working out major cultural problems. A few choice words can completely recast a plot to represent the teller's stand or cater to the listener's demands on a social issue of immediate importance. They are collaboratively designed by the tellers and the listeners who project the images to sound out the fault lines in our community, the social fissures that the group needs to mend, and the hard choices that they need to make to figure out where they're going to go from here when the master narrator is negotiating that very idea with them. Embedded in such tales are cruxes that I call pressure points. A narrator can exploit them to push the tale toward one special meaning or another. For example, a teller can pressure the plot of Merry Wise to center on the tension between Merry Wise and his brothers, and there are many tales that do exactly that, or upon the figure of the witch as a symbol for some societal or psychic evil that they have to deal with. But Sidney's Merry Wise was shaped to help Jane discover her inner resources as a problem solver. And that's the way she carried the story with her up to the present day. She turns 80 this year. And Sidney did such a persuasive job that she trained Jane to become the ultimate overcomer and problem solver. Jane was an adult before she consciously realized the import of many of the subliminal lessons that Sidney had packed into her performance in Merry Wise. She began volunteering to assist traumatized veterans in military hospitals, and then she became a psychologist herself, often reshaping her grandmother's stories to treat her own patients. So Jane became her grandmother, the creator of Mary Wise and Mary Wise himself, all of those things. Sidney's shared dream came true. Mary Wise scripted Jane's future. And she became fully aware of that by the time she was around 40 years old. When I went to visit her in the year 2000, she welcomed me into a bedroom that was a shrine to her grandmother with all of her favorite things all around me. It is the performance of the shared dream that ensures the unique power of the oral traditional tale as a medium for persuasion and healing. And it gives the storyteller a greater power than books and movies ever can have to sway the listener. A folk narrator can retain this power, though, only by sharing it. There are no Emily Dickinsons among storytellers. You don't tell your tale to a wall and expect it to survive. Your art thrives only insofar as it engages the audience, and it can best engage them by actively involving them in creating the story. Unlike a movie, Sidney did not have to impose her images on Jane. She merely hinted them, and these suggestions then gave Jane the power to dream back to the storyteller. The storyteller might be the dreamer, but the listener dreams back. Again, the fairy tale is designed to inspire images, but not to complete them. In the darkness of the shared dream, the fleshed out images are born in the listener's own mind. For example, Sidney never said a word about what Mary Wise looked like, and this blankness demanded that Jane shape something out of the darkness. 57 years after she first heard the story of Mary Wise, she told me how she viewed him when Sidney told the story. He was small, smaller than the other boys, of course, maybe up to their shoulders, and he wore sort of a knickers-like clothing like little boys would wear back then. And he had a little boy haircut, came down over his ears, it was sort of round, and he had freckles. I had freckles too. I started out ashamed of them, but my grandmother told me that she had freckles as a child, and freckles would make me beautiful. And so when I pictured Mary Wise as sandy blonde hair and freckles, sort of like me. Surprise, surprise. In dreaming back to the storyteller, Jane recreated Mary Wise as herself. Jane's grandmother was a master storyteller because she was able to coax Jane into finishing that story. This is where the peculiar power of oral stories shows itself the greatest. Like a dream, it comes to us in the darkness, but unlike ourselves in the dream state, we are conscious. And when a story is told, we begin dreaming back in ways that we tend to remember consciously and longer and better than the words of the story itself. In the end, it's not the goal of the great storyteller to rob us of our imaginations, but rather to persuade us by bringing us hints that activate our power to fill in the dream for us to surrender to the storyteller's suggestion and then take the lead as creator. And here, again, is where the oral story is more powerful than a film. When we watch a film in a theater, the director and the cinematographer throw these images at us. But when the story comes to our own closed eyes in the midst of darkness, we create everything ourselves in this process of dreaming back. So we are actively and consciously co-creating the story. This process of shared dreaming creates a special sort of consciousness by bringing together the opposite sides of the brain. And in listening to great narrators explain their art, folklorists have found substantial evidence that the masters do little to remember the words of the previous stories, and that they do not memorize the plots in a verbal way, but rather that they see the entire story as they tell it. In the 1970s, Donald Archie MacDonald, working with the Gaelic-speaking narrators, explored the visual memories of these storytellers and found something similar going on there. At the same time, in French Canada, Vivienne Labrie noted how Francophone narrators in her region saw the stories that they told. And Jane Muncie has told us how she sees her stories. When she tells Mary Wise today, she is still translating into words the images created in her head decades ago when Sidney told the story, and she has nurtured these in her mind ever since. So shared dreaming calls upon us to mix the persuasive power of story with the emotional impact of image in a way that few other sensory experiences can equal. I've called upon hard science to help my very soft but strongly felt convictions of what Jane Muncie experienced in hearing, telling, and healing through stories. Perhaps no one can ever prove that stories saved Jane's emotional life, but ask her what she thinks. And her answer is compelling enough to make me believe the science because Jane has experienced what they say. We may all want the science to back us up, but my first job as a folklorist is always to try to represent the storytellers on their own terms and the people who share their culture with me. And in explaining Jane's art, as she and I have experienced it, her explanations, my reactions, I believe that I've done just that. So I'm here to legitimize the science, not to legitimize Jane by saying that she follows some rules that scientists have followed. But I also raise this question because it's an enormous one. On the basis of 12 years' experience, I am convinced that the healing properties of story hearing and storytelling offer our best opportunity to heal communities affected by large-scale disasters. For Jane, the story world was both a refuge and a war zone. It was a place where she could feel the intensity of her own fears and yet begin to find a way past them, because first she shared, in a very real way, the feelings of Mary Wise, but on another level, she was fully aware that she was not facing witches with knives poised to cut her throat. And after all, in these stories, it was the good folks who ended up on top. So Jane, in listening, not only thrived but prospered. In 1979, I was listening to a French-Canadian narrator tell me an hour-long tale. I listened intently at the kitchen table at the old man's hypnotically whispery voice, while his grandchildren in the next room laughed and played games. When his tale ended, I asked him if his grandchildren liked hearing that story. They never listened to any of my stories, he said solemnly. But I will always tell them, because there has to be some place in the world where everything works out the way it should. So his stories had to be told, and even at his age, they had to be told, if only to himself. They remained his war zone and his refuge and his way of getting on to the next day with the difficulties that he suffered. At least as much as Jane, survivors of massive disasters need the war zone refuge of story. But the stakes are more immediate when the narrators are in fact inhabiting a war zone, and the dynamics must differ. The story they tell must be about themselves, and not in any coded way. It has to be their story as they recognize it and can convey it to others as their story. My gosh, I left a lot out of here. In 2005, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, I was volunteering in a shelter in Houston, Texas, as some 250,000 survivors flooded into the city. I was not there to record stories, but to help with whatever they needed. But I could not help hearing them without ever having to ask. I walked with one very tall man, I think it was about 6'7" by American measurements, this thin older gentleman, trying to help him find a new pair of pants long enough in the leg to reach his ankles. And that took a long time. And as we searched, he whispered his harrowing tale, not to me really, but it seemed to me simply to help himself believe that this had happened to him. To work for him, the story could not be coded or distanced. He needed to be telling it about him, and this need was undeniably great. Years later, visiting Japan in the wake of the Great East Japan earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown, I told a survivor about the tall man who had to tell him the story. Yes, she said, I had to do the same thing. That's the way it works. So instead of projecting themselves into fanciful alter egos, survivors must place their undisguised selves at their story centers. And instead of reciting consciously fictional series of events, they must tell their own stories as best as they feel and remember them. And yes, this is the same as in Jane Muncie's case. They must own their own stories. These stories must be completely about them. When Hurricane Katrina hit, I had just published a book featuring oral narratives on deposit in the Library of Congress, including my recordings of Jane and her grandmother's life, saving tales, but also narratives from September 11 and the attack on New York City. And these 9/11 stories had been recorded within a month of the disaster, maybe 2 months of the disaster, by various individuals, some folklorists, but the stories I found most powerful and most healingly told were those recorded by the family, the friends, the fellow firefighters of the narrators, people who inhabited the war zone along with the teller. That shared experience seemed to make the story easier for the teller. The narrator was unafraid of crying or being judged by the listener or being misunderstood. On the basis of that experience, and with fellow folklorist Pat Jasper, I founded the world's first project in which the disaster survivors became the interviewers. This was the first project in which the disasters themselves, the survivors themselves, became the leading documenters of their experience. And we knew on the basis of long field work experience, both of us, that such sharing of stories would be good for the survivors. But in fact, we underestimated just how good it would be for them in these circumstances. It seems to have been the strongest emotional healing project attempted after Hurricane Katrina. The other psychological projects failed, and they eventually gave us money to do more of our interviewing because it did work for the survivors. Various professional psychologists instituted programs that might have succeeded, but the survivors were too busy surviving to go visit a therapist for personal reasons. They were supporting their families. Or those psychologists were convinced that psychological healing is enhanced when patients pay a little bit of money for this therapeutic work that they do. These people were too busy feeding their families on almost no money to go and give money to a psychologist. They would be denying their own child to do this. Or some psychologists were pursuing a program of what they called reframing, helping the victims find a happy ending to their stories. But the survivors did not want to give their stories up. They didn't want someone else to finish their stories. They'd already had stories imposed upon them by the media about how these were really criminals instead of victims of this, how they didn't save each other, how only outsiders saved them. And they didn't want to have anything to do with anyone taking their stories away. Many had arrived in Houston with literally nothing besides their stories and the clothes on their backs. They had arrived under a cloud of alternative facts, media legends that portrayed them as looting and shooting at people. And as in the case of Jane Muncie, their stories were themselves. They had to keep themselves. Pat and I recognized this almost immediately and put together a program with the primary rule that the storytellers would own their stories. The central rule of our method was only survivors interview other survivors. In one day's training, half the trainees told their stories to fellow survivors. The next day they traded places, and the people who had recorded the story before were telling them now. All had the experience of representing themselves in story as well as in doing their best to record and represent their interviewee. In this method, I believe there's an analog to the kind of shared dreaming that makes the telling of traditional stories such an important psychological, social, and personal healing experience. Then we work by a set of guidelines based on the idea of sovereignty over one's own story. The cardinal rule, the narrator is always right. Whatever she wants to do or say is okay. The interviewer might ask a few questions, but nothing that he asks is as important as what she wants to say. Much like the nighttime story sessions in which Jane Muncie heard her grandmother's stories as they slept in the same bed, there was a bond of intimacy that formed immediately among these fellow survivors. The narrator may not have known the interviewer when the story started, but their bond as fellow survivors made them immediately and fully trustful of each other. Nothing, no ethnic, economic, geographic, or political difference could trump the bond of trust that was shared by fellow survivors. Now that my hometown of Houston is again flooded with hurricane survivors, I am exploring how these stories work and what makes them best for healing. And one of the things I've been trying to explore with you is how their mechanisms of healing do and do not parallel traditional American telling. I think there are things that we and only we as folklorists can find out about why this kind of storytelling can be so important for survivors, as I've experienced it to be. As in the shared dreaming of traditional narration, the survivor stories are created in collaboration with a listener whose experience is intimately connected to the tellers. But in divergence from this traditional therapy that I've learned about from Jane Muncie, it is most important for the teller rather than for the listener to own the tale. It's worth remarking that in all the situations that I've explored with you today, self-sovereignty and ownership of the story depend on intimate sharing, the sort of sharing that is not found in the mass shared nightmares that we experience together in darkened movie theaters. There is a social base to these communal dreams that reaffirms the fundamental importance of folklore as community culture, face-to-face culture, a guarantee that the need for our discipline will never disappear. As the Indian in the story recognizes, a person who dreams no more has lost his power, and he has lost his story, at which point we as folklorists have lost our jobs. All of us, traumatized or simply in need of a war zone refuge, must dream some more. Thank you. Now.
I'm going to stay over here because there's a microphone, but we have some time for a few questions or comments. If you push the little speak button down on the desk here, then you can be heard. If you wish not to be heard, don't push the speak button, but it's your choice. So, any questions or comments from the floor? Yes, in the back. There's on the right-hand speak button. Yeah.
Hello?
Hi.
Oh, sorry. This is very much as an outsider looking in. I don't know very much about folklore. I'm along with my husband, but it seems from an outsider looking in that it's two different things that are going on in parallel. You have Jane Muncie, who's being told almost, well, hypothetical stuff and transforming it to be relevant to her. But the survivors that you're speaking about are telling their stories. There's nothing hypothetical at them at all. And I wonder if in the urban setting, then that's where we're going to go. We're only going to have things that have happened to us. I didn't see any evidence whatever in conurbations of a traditional, I'm a narrator telling a group of people a hypothetical story where they can put their own interpretation on it.
I see what you're.
It's
a very good question, and it's one that requires some clarification from me, so I'm happy to do that. Number one, the stories that people chose to tell were largely not about them. In many cases, they were memorializing their neighborhoods, for example, that had disappeared, and they wanted to tell you about a place they lived 50 years ago, or for 50 years, that they could visit no more. So they were highly personal stories, but they were stories that celebrated others. In none of these narratives, no matter how self-evidently, heroically the character had acted, did the narrator had acted in the story, the narrator never took credit as the primary figure or the hero. this person was always celebrating the other person. So as the stories emerged, and this is something I did not really have a chance to tell you when I was talking about, there's an enormous amount of humility shown, an enormous amount of deference to the community itself. And these are stories then that really strive to find a common communal ground. I get tired of the me generation and all stories being about me and the personal narrative taking over, but you might say these are the most communal personal narratives I've ever run into. And there is a kind of formularicity that they began to follow, which reflected a great deal of shared experience, so that the person, I don't think even consciously tried to foreground his or her experience here, but always talked about something that affected the listener. And the story performance itself was often followed by a very emotional interchange between the listener and the teller about what they felt together. So I think there is a sense of community there that we don't normally see in what is normally characterized as a personal experience narrative. And I think in that sense, it's very much the sort of bonding that Jane Muncie's grandmother was trying to enforce. Yes, she was trying to build up Jane as a person, but she was also trying to build her up as a grandmother and as someone who, as a granddaughter, and as someone who came from her family. Again, in parts of Jane's experience that I could not summarize for you, she would begin these narrations by reciting her family from as far back, the names of her family members from as far back as she could. And she would tell a story that was a favorite to her, and also a story that was favorite to Jane. So I see in many ways the collaborative process working very well here. Now, I think there is one very distinctive difference. When people sit down to share these kitchen table stories in normal situations outside of our project, they normally talk back and forth quite a bit and finish each other's stories. But what we found here was that what everybody wanted to do was honor the full-blown narrative of that individual who hadn't been recorded before and didn't feel represented. So there was a lot of training, which was very easy for the interviewers to follow, in how you encourage someone to tell and how you show your excitement through visual gestures and hand gestures, so forth and so on. So there was a huge degree of interactivity in these personal narratives that made it more a communal event. Having said that, there are still quite a few differences in what goes on in the therapeutic aspects of these stories, and I'm trying to figure out more about ways in which looking at their similarities, but also very, very definitely their differences, can be useful. I hope that helps.
How do you see these being used in conflict resolution, or do you see them being used?
I think they're used in conflict resolution all the time in traditional societies. In terms of, do you want me to talk about that or about the survivor projects, or both?
Survivors of conflict, say in Bosnia, conflict
Okay,
groups,
that's very tough, and actually I'm now working with someone who's out of Bosnia, and we're trying to figure out how some of these things work. What we found among the Katrina survivors was that they were so much in the same boat that there wasn't a lot of conflict among them. When they first arrived, there was a kind of hierarchy with the people who had to be plucked off of the rooftops, sort of being looked up to and saying, well, my situation has been a tougher one than yours. But as time passed, they were all homeless. They didn't want to be living where they were living. They wanted to go back, and they couldn't go back. And that shared experience was able to resolve any kind of conflict that might come up within that community that we encountered. But what was a conflict was the tension between these survivors and their new hosts. When they first showed up in Houston, they were welcomed by people who were very generous, and I was very proud of my city. But within a year, there were people saying, these folks are causing crime, these folks don't know how our world works. Mayor White, go send them back, which of course he didn't do and didn't want to do. And one of the parts of our project had to do with these survivors. When we asked them, why are you doing this? They gave many different answers, but the prevailing one was, we're in a place that doesn't understand us, and even the most generous people don't know who we are. We want people to know who we are. And on the basis of their desire to be heard, we put together a series of radio programs. And again, the radio programs mirrored what they wanted to have represented. In the first one, which came up on the first anniversary of Katrina, and right in the midst of this first backlash, when all of a sudden people were saying, go home, they wanted a program that said thank you to everyone who helped us. It was a lot of social engineering, a lot of thought that they put into this. And so we did this program about people who were helped by people for no particular reason. I called it Intimate Strangers, and person after person was talking about the great things that they had received from the people of Houston and their gratitude toward those people. And it went NPR, it went all across the country in the US. But I think it was the beginning of their being able to take a platform and say, hey, we are your neighbors now, and we deeply appreciate it. I thought it was psychologically a brilliant move on their part, strategically. And we also had exhibits in which their photographs appeared. The photograph you see here, for example, was a part of an exhibit that was called Who We Are. And by each of these photos, there was part of this person's narrative talking about what he got out of this. All these people, they did not want to be photographed as having old shirts or looking sad or anything. They all wanted to look the way they were. Again, this is what we want people to know who we are. And those exhibits had a great deal of influence, I think, on people who came to them. The survivors themselves came and brought their families, and they got to meet the individuals who wanted to know more about who they were. So I think there are ways that all of this can be done. And the most immediate way is to put up a website called Who We Are. That was our last go, was Who We Are, whatever it might be after Hurricane Harvey, where people get to say exactly what they want to say. And where, as individuals, they can present themselves and their own ideas. But after a certain part in this interviewing process, people reach some common ground on what they think are the most important things to share with outsiders. And my guess will be, if this project works as well as the earlier one, that within 6 or 7 months they'll be saying, I want to do a program on this, I want to do a program on that. And that will be part of the instrumentality for conflict resolution. Now, when you talk about someplace like Bosnia, when you may have been, your relative may have been killed by your next door neighbor, and people don't know who their friends and enemies are when they arrive as refugees, that's a much more difficult situation. I'm trying to work on ways in which a project like that might work. And this June I will be meeting with people who are trying to do something similar with Palestinians and Israelis. And it's beyond anything I can imagine right now. I don't have any good answers for how something like that would work out.
Thank you.
But if you do, I'd love to hear it. Any ideas at all on that?
Anyone else? Other? Yes, in the back.
I wonder if you found many people in the Survivor Project who didn't want to participate.
Yes, you did. One thing, we had so many survivors there and so little money that we actually advertised this as a job. And we asked people at the various workforce stations where you can go and look for a job, as our job description, do you really want to do this? And then in the training, we asked them if they really wanted to do this, because it can traumatize the interviewer to do this. There's something called secondary traumatization when you hear enough terrible stories from other people. But when you have the primary traumatization yourself, you might not want to hear this, and there are a number of people who fall in that category. Similarly, we didn't encourage anybody to tell his or her own story. The interviewees did not get paid. You never want to give people incentive to pay their, or to tell their trauma stories. They have to really want to do that. And there was a good deal of uncertainty among certain people who really wanted to tell their stories, but they didn't feel quite good enough to do it. So we would, every interviewer who set up interviews was at least one time told, showing up at the door with the recorder, I really want to do this, but I just can't do it today. And of course you have to honor it. The principal idea is that this is to heal, and people don't tell these stories if they're coerced. So there were people who were reluctant, who after time really wanted to tell their stories. There were people who told their stories one time and said, that really isn't my story, throw that one away, I want to tell you another one. But you have to build in the certainty that some people aren't ready to tell their stories into the project and make sure that no one who doesn't want to do this gets caught doing it. Among the people employed as interviewers, they went through 5 days of training, and there was one person who after day said, I'm not ready to hear these stories again, and stepped away from the job. But everyone else who took on that job went at least somewhere. Another thing that happened, though, was that I found that the people who had the most difficult times really were able to tell their stories well, but they had a hard time listening to others. So some of the people who trained with us may have interviewed only one person, but they stuck around. They still came to the events, they listened to other people, but they weren't ready. They felt still too full of their own story and too hurt by their own story to bring in others. And those are all things that we worked into our methodology to try to ensure that nobody who told this story got hurt. Everybody benefited at least a little bit from telling it.
Yeah, have to.
Well, I am an environmental scientist. I have just a slightly different question maybe in here. In all these you call it natural disasters. So you ever came across with people, most of the time people blaming Mother Nature, but we put a different perspective as an environmentalist that it's some of the things are like man-made disasters. So you ever came across with the stories or people telling you that, okay, well, this is just, a disaster or just like a man-made? Do they, like in terms of all these, what's happening in all over the world, this climate is changing and these things never used to happen years and years ago, but it's happened so quickly now over the years that people start believing that something is changing. Mm-hmm. So do you ever came across with people telling you like stories, anything like that?
I'm not sure I fully understand what you're saying, but I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that so far I've been working with disasters in close proximity in time. But I do want to tell you that we don't begin these projects until about 5 months after a disaster because people are too busy surviving. This is a secondary response to the disaster that we undertake here. So was that part of what you were asking?
Yeah, I mean, these disasters, sometimes we call them natural disasters. Is that right? Yeah.
Are you saying natural or national disasters?
Natural disasters.
Okay. I've been told by people that this kind of methodology could very well work out in all kinds of circumstances. We've worked with natural disasters mainly, but many of these disasters have also had a human component. Anybody who came out of Katrina will tell you, okay, there was the hurricane, but it was a human-made disaster as well because of the way that the poorer neighborhoods were neglected, the way that people neglected to build protections for these individuals, so that becomes part of the story. I've heard the same thing with Hurricane Harvey, and I know it as a long-time resident of Houston, that there was a huge amount of misengineering and misleading and abuse of people that led them into neighborhoods that flooded in the first place. And some people will look at this primarily as a political situation, and whatever they want to look at it is what they should report. The interviewee is always right. They can take that story in any direction that they want to take it. And a number of people wanted to talk in these interviews directly to the U.S. government and say, you did this to me, and directly to their fellow New Orleanians or fellow Americans and say, no country should allow this to happen to the people there. So there are people who use this very specifically for political reasons, also to memorialize friends they've lost. Many different reasons. We tried to honor every single reason there a person might have for telling these. I'm hopeful that we were able to do that. We had, for example, one person who thanked Katrina for getting him off heroin. He was an addict before Katrina, but after going through Katrina, he said, I don't need heroin to experience intensity anymore. I think I can get into another way of life. So whatever these people see in the disasters is important. And the different interviewers, many of whom had very different experiences, the parts that were awful for some were good for the others, etc., honor the fact that none of them had been adequately listened to. So they were very good listeners. And even if they did not have political ideas, they honored the political ideas of the other person. And I think that the fellow survivors did a marvelous job of representing the other person with as little of their own subjective views intruding upon the voice of the speaker as I've seen even the best trained, most sensitive folklorists use. That respect for what the personal truth of that individual is very high.
Right, a semi-final question. Yes, Hilary. It says speak on the black panel.
Is that it? Oh, there we are. Can't remember what I was going to say now. Gone a blank. Oh, young people today with parents who are so busy that they can't talk to them, can't read to them, don't tell them stories. Where are they getting their stories from?
Because there are people all in this room who can tell you many different answers to that. I found in the sort of family magic tale environment that it's largely the grandparents who are able to do it, and it goes back several generations. They and the kids have more time on their hands, and that's been the typical situation. I have very little experience with talking to people who tell the magic tales, for example, the fairy tales, who learn them from their parents, almost always their grandparents or an older relative, usually a relative, but someone who has a little bit more time. Anybody else want to take on where the story's coming from? They're coming from just about everywhere.
Twitter.
Yeah.
Twitter. Mm.
Yeah.
Right, I'd like to finish off with one question that echoes this murmuring of the president that I just heard behind me. You mentioned fiction acts as a flight simulator, and fiction has very powerful resonance with our brains and neurons and so on. So does that relate to the effectiveness of fake news in persuading people of this or that?
I think it absolutely does. I think the fake news syndrome, I mean, if you look at something like Fox News in the States, and I don't know what awful equivalent you have here, but most everybody does have an awful equivalent. They tell the stories. You know, they always have to have a plot. They don't analyze the plot. You know, the plot that Hillary Clinton is running a child abuse ring out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. That comes pretty close to a fantasy tale right there. It certainly didn't happen, but it was. I think they choose the tales. They choose some of these things that will generate these images that go, you know, that take you out of any place you've seen in the world to make those tales work. Yeah, I believe that they are in some ways drawing upon the strategy of the magic tale to bring together the plot and these images you can't forget. A child abuse ring in a pizza parlor, visited by Hillary Clinton. I think even my most aberrant dream has never come quite that close to absurdity. And for somehow that absurdity is persuasive to an appalling number of people.
Yes, Nick, final question.
I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the role of social activism in our discipline, because you're one of the people who really, does so much in terms of working with people today, and in this case, victims of disasters. And I know a lot of disciplines, there's sort of maybe a separation between the research side and the public engagement side and working with people. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more what you think folklorists can do in terms of social activism and that kind of thing.
Well, I really do believe that it's our job. It's my little proverb here that our goal, as necessary to pursue as it is impossible to reach, is to represent the people we write about on their own terms. And if we do this well, we will be speaking to them as persuasively and accepted by them as much as any of our academic colleagues. I think that if you believe that, if you want to represent people on their own terms, then folklore is by definition a work of advocacy. I think it's advocacy if we're representing their personal truths. Now, I put this in print at one time, and there have been debates over it. I remember Elliot Oring writing back to a statement I made of this sort, saying that, well, representing people on their own terms, is that really a kind of advocacy? And he used, or does it have to be? Are we fooling ourselves here? And he used the example of a Jewish reporter, he wasn't a folklorist, who wanted to study all these groups that hated Jews. And he went around to person after person, sort of asking questions about, why don't you like Jews, so forth and so on. A lot of these ended up in screaming matches, so forth and so on. That is not folklore fieldwork. That is investigative reporting at its best and psychodrama at its worst. I think when we go out as folklorists, I think you have to do folklore with someone you really like, someone you love, someone you feel you can represent as best you can. There's no one we know to whom we don't object to one thing or another that they've done in their lives. But I think the preponderance of affection and respect for those people has to be there. How else do you represent them on their own terms? We have some of these rules. Well, we can't erase this from this tale. That would be not telling the truth. We edit ourselves all the time. We edit ourselves ad infinitum. And so why should we then take a transcript from the field and say that all these words have to go there? Why can't we collaborate more with the people we're working with? They are the people who have so much extraordinary influence on the day-to-day world. Folklore is still the major means through which people learn what they learn as kids. They pick up the unofficial culture that we come to study. And they should be able to use their folklore and use us as their vessels for representation. So I feel we've made too big a separation between the folklore and the folklorists, the folklore practitioners and the students of folklore. The American Folklore Society, which I love in many respects, it's my favorite group, is really the American Folklorist Society. And I got really angry when they picked up the motto, keeping folklorists connected. Well, we do okay, but what about the people we study? Why don't they show up there? Why can't we have more of their participation in what we do? So I think that's one of many ways. Collaboratively authoring things, which I've done with both survivors and with Jane Muncie, is really important. These are their words, and no big idea we have about them, I think, is as important as the idea that they be represented on their own terms. And I think we're moving that way. I think there are people doing great things. But we were all trained to come out with a dissertation that said something that nobody else had ever thought of before. And that's the opposite of traditional culture, where these individuals we talk to will give their parents and their grandparents and their community all the credit for what they think. And they will be excited about what they've done in relationship to this great communal enterprise of which they are part. We're not going to get rid of the dissertation and all that sort of thing, but I think it would be remarkable if we did make our academic exercises correspond more closely to what the storytellers, the musicians, the traditional craftspeople do when they're sitting around talking about their art. I think we could learn enormous things about this. Folklore is by definition, at least my definition, unofficial culture. And if you come into an arena like this, this is not unofficial culture. When you read a paper like I was reading, that's not unofficial culture. So we're using tools that work against us to try to represent people who just don't live by those rules. And I think we have to bend them a little bit. I think it was great that here at Aberdeen, wasn't Stanley Robertson made an honorary member of the faculty? Was he made a doctor of folklore? Okay, that's the sort of thing that can begin. So we bring him into our linguistic and our hierarchical and our honorific sphere. But how can he bring us in where we would be the honored special people in his traditional life? And if we start doing that, then I think we're doing exactly what we want to be doing.
Right, thank you very much. Just before you all go, I'd like you to join us for some smoked salmon and cheese and oatcakes out in the foyer there. Thanks to our sponsors, Yugi Salmon Fishings in Peterhead and Highland Fine Cheeses in Tain, the last place that Elvis is known to have been sighted, and Walker's Shortbread as well. And finally, to thank our speaker, who I think has represented himself quite truly to himself, I hope. So thank you, Carl Lindahl, for a fascinating evening.